Her name was, well, before I tell you her name, she sits on the board of her synagogue in Brooklyn, and she is deeply committed to the Jewish people and to Jewish values, and that motivates her in her work. She's an investigative reporter for the New York Times, and she recently wrote a book that was made into a film. And the name of the book and the name of the film was She Said. And She Said was the work of two investigative reporters, including Jodi Kantor, who I sat with, a wonderful Jewish woman who really tries to pursue justice. And if you know the book or if you know the film, what Jodi Kantor did is she revealed the indiscretions of and the horrific behavior of Harvey Weinstein. And by doing so, she almost single-handedly will change the culture, both in Hollywood as well as much of corporate America. And I know if you're like me, when that story first broke, you know, we were so deeply disturbed by this story and the fact that Harvey Weinstein was most obviously a Jewish man. But at the end of the day, Harvey Weinstein stood for nothing Jewish at all, but Jodi Kantor stands for everything Jewish. It was wonderful to meet her. It was wonderful to speak with her. She's a very, very humble person who just believes that people have the right to know. And so she commits herself to that wonderful work. So that was one thing that happened this week. I could tell you about 4 other incredible stories. So we've come to the end of what I consider to be the second greatest story ever told. What, you might ask? The book of Genesis is the second greatest story ever told? And I say yes, because next week we're going to begin the greatest story ever told as we start the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus. The Parsha, as we spoke about and as you know, is named Vayechi, and he lived. And like earlier in the book of Genesis, where Chayei Sarah was not about the life of Sarah at all, but Sarah's death and burial, this Parsha, and he lived, in a rather protracted dying experience, describes a rather protracted dying experience of Yaakov. And in it there is so much to learn. And the truly beautiful aspect of studying Torah is not simply what we learn about the text and the past. It's also about how the text speaks to us in the present. And that is why the person who stands here in my place can make connections between the world that we live in, our culture, politics, our families, our relationships, and these very ancient stories. And I think it's a chiyuv. I think it's an obligation to make those connections. And so we see that there's a timeless element in all of this. So this morning what I want to do is take 3 elements from this story, from the description of Jacob's death, and see how each one of these elements can teach us and enrich us. The first has to do with the nature of our lives and our connections, our relationships. Judaism teaches us that we are part of something much larger than ourselves. Our perspective on life and the values decisions that we make should be based on the fact that we are not first and foremost responsible for ourselves, but we have responsibility for each other, for our community, for our people, for this world. We live in relationships. And that's perhaps one of the most important features in all of our lives. When I do weddings, I speak about the name of the ceremony typically. The ceremony is Kiddushin, holiness. And holiness does have many dimensions. For there is holiness in time, and we recognize that as we sit here on Shabbat. There's holiness in a place, in space. but ultimately there is holiness in relationship. Martin Buber spoke about the holiness that is in the space between ourselves and the object of our love, between you and your loved ones. So Jacob goes through a long process in his dying. And I apologize to those who were in my class yesterday morning. I'm going to mention one of the things that we spoke about. But before he dies, he gathers all of his sons around his deathbed, and he blesses them. And after the blessing, the text says, Vayvarech otam ish asher kebirchato. He blesses each one of them according to his blessing. And then when he dies, the language there, and also the language at the end of the Parsha, which talks about the death of Joseph, is contained in the words, and he was gathered unto his people. Perhaps it had to do with becoming a part of his sons' lives and their futures. That's common, that language, in biblical literature. To die is to join with others, those who are around you and those who came before you. And perhaps it has to do with those who are not yet born, but they are going to be a part of your people and a part of your future, inheriting your values. Here's this story, and this is what I apologize to the class about. There's a Hasidic legend. And the legend states that in heaven there's a very, very large banquet hall. And it's open to all who have lived good lives. I had known this story, and then it became particularly meaningful to me when my own grandmother was dying. For she knew she was dying. She was in the hospital. She had been there from Rosh Hashanah, and now this was Yom Kippur. And she said to the family, I'm ready to go. My table is set, and they're waiting for me. And what a beautiful and comforting thought that was. And it remains so for my entire family. I see this reflected in funerals that I do. Many of us from this congregation were gathered this week to say farewell at a beautiful funeral for our dear beloved B. Gold. And we were privileged to hear the words of her children and her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren. And those of us who were here gave witness to this idea that she was gathered unto her people. She was gathered to her family, to her community. Literally hundreds of us sat together here in honor and memory as she was gathered unto her people. But perhaps an even more profound and real issue had to do with the fact that Jacob's sons were there around his deathbed as he was dying. And there is another message. The message is that nobody should die alone. My sense is that that can be terrifying. In that sense is also reflected in our codes, in our law. We should never leave the deathbed of one who is dying. We sit with that person. We hold their hands. We speak to them. We stroke their heads and touch them. And we let them know that they are not alone, and we give them all the comfort we can give as we literally walk them through the last door. And there is comfort in that. So the first lesson is we don't live alone. We're not intended to be alone. We need others, and we need to be with others, and others need us. Here's the second message. And this one I think is so very important to all of those who are parents or grandparents or children, even if we were children a long time ago. In the words of the blessing that Jacob gives to his sons, we find that those are hardly blessings at all. I'm not even sure why they're called blessings. But rather what we see in those verses are reflections of the lives that each of them lived. And we see the vision of their world to come. As the text says, Vayvarechotam ish asher keberchato. He blessed each man according to his blessing. It's a difficult verse. But what follows, or what we see, is that each son received his own unique blessing, his own unique description. As I said, reflective of the things that they had done in their lives and the things that would happen to them and to the tribes of Israel that grew out of them. I have a very vivid memory that I want to share. It's a memory of being in the delivery room when my children were born. And I'm sure everyone who has experienced this also has a similar vivid memory. It's so very powerful. It is being a witness to the miracle of creation. When my second child was born, my daughter Gabrielle, I remember a very specific thought and feeling. I was amazed that Gabrielle looked so different than Avi. I thought that my wife and I would replicate what we had already created, but we didn't. We created a new life and a different life. It wasn't just the physical difference that was so apparent as soon as she was born. There was much more, for she was a different child with a very different temperament, a very different spirit, and very unique capabilities. As parents, we need to learn that about our children. As grandparents, we need to learn that about our grandchildren. As children, we have to realize that about ourselves. I watch carefully the parents in our preschool. I have my own children and grandchildren. And I see how challenging it is to be able to see the differences in each of them, to understand and respect that they learn differently, they have different temperaments, they have different interests, they see the world in different ways. We cannot make them all behave as if they're the same. The respect for difference on the most personal level is so critical and very important to their development and to their sense of self. I have a secret. They're not all going to be doctors. You may know that in communities where everyone is meant to be in a particular mold, behave in a very rigid and defined way, children are so often dressed the same. I used to think that was only true in certain types of very strict communities like the Amish, or when I would walk by nearby parochial schools. But then I went to Mea Sharim, and I've driven through Williamsburg so many times, and I saw that the kids there are all dressed in the same outfits. At first, it seemed pretty cute. Girls of different ages all wearing the same type of jumpers with the same plaids. You know, at B'nai Torah, we host weddings frequently here, and very often on Tuesday night, they're from the most religious communities around here. And I know when I walk through on my way out of the building, so many of the kids are dressed the same. Little boys with the same patterns on their bow ties, wearing the same vests, the same pants and shoes. It is quaint, no doubt about it, but there's something more in this when you think about the particular types of communities that they come from. The point here is that typically these are communities that don't allow for a great deal of individual expression. Communities that really don't respect difference. To a much greater extreme, and I say lahavdil, we note that you all know autocratic states. And what we've seen amongst fascists and communist nations. The outward dress is only symbolic of an ideology that doesn't allow for difference. I say lahavdil, it's very different, but it is an indicator. In so many ways, we have spoken about the Jewish tradition, that is, we who are part of this conservative movement, the Masorti movement, We understand that we come from a tradition that values pluralism. Not only do we believe that there are different people in this world and that we need or are required to respect all different types of people and the choices they make, because it's so fundamental to our rabbis' teachings from the Talmud. People believe differently, and people live their Jewish lives differently. But they're all Jewish when they identify as being Jewish. There are multiple texts that teach this, and we've learned them here. And they may be the most important of all of our rabbinic teachings, and they were way ahead of their times. Our rabbis accepted that we live our lives differently, of course. However, there are boundaries as to what we can and cannot do. But it's so important that we respect the difference. There are people who identify as Jews that commit themselves to community or particular Jewish organizations or Jewish culture or different synagogues. So today, however, we must note that we have a problem when it comes to the policies that we see being developed in Israel that threaten to divide our people. And that's about not just Israel and its policies, it's about Judaism itself. For Jewish fundamentalists have become the dominant element in the new governing coalition. And with them comes a very hostile takeover of Jewish identity, of us, of our movements. Several ministries have been created with a focus on Jewish identity, and they're led almost exclusively by members of parties representing various strands of Jewish fundamentalism. They represent ultra-nationalists and ultra-Orthodox ideals. They refuse to recognize the validity of non-Orthodox streams, movements like Reform and Reconstructionist and Conservative, which the majority of American Jews identify with. So the law of return is now being tested. The law that grants Israeli citizenship to Jews and to their descendants. It was such a fundamental part in the founding of the Jewish state and has been since then. And what we see is that Jews who are not recognized as being Jews by the Orthodox rabbinical establishment will be ineligible for automatic Israeli citizenship. A religious schism amongst our people who are so small anyway in this world could destroy a sense of joint purpose that has sustained us through thousands of years. And sadly, that united sense of mutual responsibility can be lost. Power has been given to a tiny, openly homophobic religious party. The Religious Zionism Party was tapped to run a department of Jewish identity, excluding people with other identities and ethnicities. There's now a Ministry of Heritage that will control archaeological sites and the conservation of historical sites and will be used to exclude people of other nationalities and other ethnicities. The United Torah Judaism Party is being given power to influence education and support the institutions of almost completely Haredi communities. And so the ancient text about Jacob blessing each of his children according to their uniqueness, according to their own blessing, is a text that we have to think about really carefully. It is a fundamental text to our identity. We know as Jewish people there are so many different segments to our people. Jews from Morocco were always quite different than Polish Jews. Jews from South Africa were quite different than Turkish Jews. We understand that. Their cultures were different, their foods were different, so much of their behaviors were different. And American Jewry has developed a fascinating pluralistic identity. But equally important is that there are different movements. In Israel, they refer to them as the Zra'im, the streams. And we know that each one of the approaches has something to offer. And none of them have an exclusive right to determine who is a Jew, or what it means to be Jewish, or to live as a Jew. Isn't that the beauty of Judaism? Isn't that what differentiates us from other religions? There's not a unified theology. There's not one single law. You may not pray at Bethel or daven at Chabad, but you would never say that they're not Jewish. It's the beauty of the democratic aspect of Judaism. We have to be careful as we move forward in our wishes and desires and, frankly, our rights. They have to be known, and we have to advocate for them in the places where our support for Israel is known. In spite of the difficulties right now, I know that we cannot lessen our support one iota. But our support for Israel has to be a support for the Israel we want to see. And that's the Israel for all Jewish people. And that's an Israel that represents a modern democracy also. So the description of the blessings have to be taken to heart. All of Jacob's children are obviously Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel. And frankly, we expect that to be reflected in the way we live in our own community and the way the Jewish democratic Jewish state governs itself. So this now brings me to the third lesson. Much shorter, much simpler. You heard Joe end the Torah reading, end the book of Breshit, and said, please rise. And as we all rose, we said, Chazak, Chazak, v'nitchazek. Be strong. You be strong. I have to be strong. You be strong even if your Judaism is not the same as mine. And I'll be strong with my Jewish expression too. And by doing that, by being strong and standing up for what we believe in and what is right, we strengthen each other. I wish you all Shabbat Shalom.